Tell me the basics of mangroves that the audience can sort of gather around and get a good feel for it.
Yeah, definitely. Well, just the basic definition of a mangrove, it can refer to a tree or a whole ecosystem, but it ultimately refers to trees that grow in the intertidal zone. That's from mean sea level to the highest astronomical tide mark, occupying that coastal fringe. They usually grow in protected areas, sort of protected from waves and protected embayments, muddy areas, that kind of thing. So it refers to that whole intertidal forest area, mostly in subtropical and tropical regions.
Okay. Now how important are these? Like, why should we really care about mangroves? How important are they to the ecosystem?
It's a great question. I tell people that they're one of the most important ecosystems in the world because very few ecosystems have such direct, tangible benefit to human society. Like, we as people, and no matter whether in developed nations or developing nations, we rely on mangroves. And there's 6 kind of key reasons for that. I think that everyone knows that I would hope most people know that mangroves support fisheries in tropical and subtropical areas. But what I don't think most people do realize is that 80% or 70 to 90% of the fish that ends up on their plate has some part of their life cycle in the mangroves. So if you like fish, you like mangroves. That's what I tell people.
Right. Now, what about it? Like, why do they start their life there, or is it at some point of their life?
It depends on the species. So you can have like which have their nowfly floating around in the mangroves, and then moving offshore. Or you have fish as juveniles. Then you've got the predatory species that hang out there, and flathead, brim, fish like that feed off things coming out of the mangroves. So they move in and out of there on a tidal basis. So they go from reef to seagrass to mangrove and back and forth. Right. Even things like marine turtles are hanging out in the mangroves at times and feeding on them.
Okay. So I guess it's a lot of. I mean, most of the fish use it for protection from predators. Yeah,
it's about protection from predators, but also because there's a lot of little fish getting protected, it attracts the big fish to come up, and so the circle of life continues.
Okay. So yeah, sorry, I interrupted you, but you were going on about the 6 important points.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there's fisheries value, and then linked in that is how mangroves support coastal productivity. So they have a really high turnover of leaves and detritus. They're fast growing. Part of their adaptation to salt is they drop a lot of leaves, and those leaves get exported out off the continental shelf where they become part of the nutrient and carbon cycle in the oceans.
Yeah.
And further to that, I mean, has recently been emphasized in some really powerful scientific journals, Nature Geoscience, I think, showing that mangroves have this amazing potential for carbon sequestration and are one of the biggest carbon stores. So whilst they only occupy 5% of the world's forests, they actually have up to 50 times more carbon in their soil than a terrestrial forest. And so if we think of their values in terms of climate change adaptation and buffering the effects of climate, they're all about storing carbon.
Oh, okay.
So that's very much 3, I think. And also, most people might remember the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami.
Right.
That showed that mangroves, in areas where there were mangroves, there was less damage to the coastline and less loss of life than in areas without. And that highlights the importance of mangroves for shoreline protection. They prevent shoreline erosion and buffer wave action. And the more mangroves you've got, so the wider the area, the less wave action is going to influence sort of villages and houses, infrastructure behind the mangrove area. And that's going to become increasingly important with sea level rise, I think. So as the seas come up, if we've got that mangrove zone there, it buys us a bit of time. It's all about buying time, really. As the seas rise up, the mangroves will help buffer the impacts of sea level rise. Right. And I think the last one, the 6th reason I usually tell people is that they look good. Mangroves are aesthetically pleasing. It's nice to have a mangrove fringe along a river or that green space. If anyone has ever been out there and sort of kayaking through mangrove fringe streams and things like that, it's a beautiful, beautiful area. So much wildlife, the way the light shines through, and we try to capture that with art shows and things like that in our program. I'll go into that in a bit. I just think mangroves are a beautiful ecosystem.
Yeah. Well, I also find one of the best parts about a mangrove system is you really see the roots along the coastal fringe, and you see how big they are and how they intertwine and everything, and how it really makes to be like a physically complex look. You know, you got roots going all over the place. The trees are intertwined. It's almost like you get to see underground a little bit, but because the roots are exposed on the fringe. Is that correct, or is that just branches?
No. They have these. One of the more common species, Rhizophora, which is globally distributed. It's a mangrove genus. It's got the big stilt roots that stick out, and they help the mangroves breathe. But they're also part of the reason why they stabilize the coastline, because they've just got all these structures there holding the sediment in, and that's what gives fish protection. So that's what the fish hide amongst. But and yeah, if you can either see them exposed at low tide, or even if you go snorkeling through there at high tide, it's amazing just to see what's under there. Jellyfish and fish and squid, all sorts of crazy things are hanging out there.
Oh, I can imagine. Yeah. So how many species are there of mangroves around the world?
Well, that's a contentious question. It depends who you ask. But these are the systematic botanists, you know.
Right.
Fights about what's a mangrove and what's not a mangrove.
Yeah.
So it ranges from 80 to 100 species. There's various mangroves associates that are sort of terrestrial species that can tolerate salt, so they've got halophytic capacity. They can have some salt tolerance, but they're also found in other areas. And then you've got your true mangroves, which are those species that only exist in the mangrove zone. And there's about 80 of those. So they range from like ferns to palms to to advanced trees. So there's a whole range. It's not like mangroves are sort of one group of plants. It's a whole bunch of different plants that over time have evolutionarily evolved to be adapted to living in this coastal edge and in the tidal zone with the salt and the waterlogging and those kind of things.
Right. So is it when you say, if you look at a mangrove forest, say an average mangrove forest from, say, a satellite image, can you know, I've heard before that it's sort of like you'll get your salt tolerant sort of mangroves on the fringe, and then it's kind of separated by species. It's almost like a gradient that goes from the coast to terrestrial. How thick is that gradient usually, if that even exists, if I'm right?
Well, there's distinct zonation of species. So you've got, as you said, it's like the salt-tolerant species at the fringe, and then sort of fresh species at the back. And it's that gradient of salt tolerance. And that thickness really depends on where you are and how steep the tidal profile is, because it's all about elevation. That's one of the big driving forces. And in the mangrove forest is about the frequency of tidal inundation gives it slim salt, and also how close to freshwater you are as a groundwater source or a stream flowing out. So you have that same zonation along a tidal profile from the coast to the terrestrial fringe, but also up rivers as well. You get the same kind of gradient. So you get at the mouth of rivers, there's salt-tolerant species, and upstream you get your fresh species. So yeah, it's really and it's unique to different places, really.
Yeah. Okay. So now, you mentioned a little bit before about sort of the state of mangroves, but globally, what's the state of mangroves? Are they in pretty good condition, or are they really sort of in need of help? What's on a global perspective?